tell you a story today for about the next 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and show you a few pictures and do some historical stuff, and give you a chance to ask questions and so on. I started in this work in 1969. How many of you were born after 1969? How many of you were born before 1969? Actually, yes, that's unusual. Usually when I ask that question, almost all hands go up. And I went to work as a social worker. I took a temporary job. I just graduated from college and was married and had a baby, and I needed a job, and so I applied for state positions, and I got offered this job at a state hospital as a social worker. I was actually in training to be a teacher. So I took it thinking, oh, I'll do this for a couple of years and then I'll go back to teaching. And I still do some teaching. I worked at Laverne University and one of our community colleges. But I started as a social worker at Pacific State Hospital, which is in Pomona, California. It's now called Lanterman Developmental Center. And it's actually scheduled to be closed. And it was really an experience for me. I did work there about 2 years, and I was ready to leave, and they came to me and said, we need people with master's degrees in social work. If you go to graduate school, we'll give you a scholarship, and in return, we want you to come back and work for the state for a couple of years. So I went to graduate school and got an MSW, and then came back to do my 2 years. I actually went to work in the regional center system, and that was 40 years ago, and I never left again. When I, excuse me, I'm just getting over a little bit of a cold, so I'll get through this. When I went to work at Pacific State Hospital, they passed this little pamphlet out. And this is the original Lanterman Act, which was written in 1969. I'm going to tell you about how it came together, some stories about how it was challenged, and how we have been able to keep it, and what you must do to make sure we never lose it. So I'll pass this around. I do need it back. That's the original act. And remember, the original act was only for people with mental retardation. It was called the Lanterman Mental Retardation Services Act, AB 225, which was signed into law on September 4th, 1969. So I'm going to begin my story. You can interrupt if you want, or we can wait to the end. My remote isn't working, so I'm going to have to do these manually. The date's wrong. I apologize for that. You might take this to the future. This PowerPoint, I've emailed it to Shauna, and if you wanted a copy of it, you'll have to ask her, okay? I do have a couple of other handouts. So what we're going to do today is a brief history of services and supports for people primarily in California. I am going to talk a little bit about some national developments that impact all of us. If you had a child with a disability in the 1950s or before, you really had no or very limited options. About the only thing you could do as a parent was apply to place your child in an institution. And back in the 50s and 60s, California had 23 institutions for people with disabilities. They were in places like Auburn had one, just right down the road. You might not even be aware of that. Stockton had a state hospital. Mendocino, just all kinds of little places like that. And if a child was born with Down syndrome, for instance, the doctors would usually tell the parents, this child's disabled, they really will never amount to much, they'll be an insult on your family, and you should put them in an institution and forget that you ever had them. And that's what parents were told. And even when I worked in the regional center in the 70s and 80s, parents would still tell me stories about getting instructions like that. And these institutions weren't really very pretty places. This is a picture. How many of you ever heard the song Hotel California? Oh, you've all heard that. Hotel California by the Eagles. Legend has it that that was a story about Camarillo State Hospital, which is now closed and which is in the community I live in. This is a picture of Camarillo State Hospital bell tower. And the album cover, people say, modeled that. And if you ever listen to the word, next time you hear that song, listen to the words very, very carefully, because it's really symbolic about being locked up in an institution. There's one line in there that says you can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. And that's the way these institutions were. Parents could just sign their children in, even adults. They had no legal rights, they had no due process, and admission was for life. There wasn't really such thing as you possibly could get out of here. And these institutions were all over California. They were large. I remember when I first went to work at Pacific, they had, and these are horrible terms, I even hate to use them, they had two classes of patients. They had what they called high grades and low grades. Because I was new and only had a bachelor's degree, they gave me 3 wards of low grades. Or, I'm sorry, high grades, because they felt I wasn't trained well enough to deal with the more complex people. And I remember I went out on Ward 15, which was one of my wards, and there were 120 men lined up, cot, nightstand, with 3 staff to take care of them, feed them, and everything. It was just absolutely a nightmare. How many of you seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Jack Nicholson. It's really a very powerful movie, and there's a lot of truth to it. Hollywood sometimes makes up things in movies, but that movie is very realistic of what it was like in an institution. The most powerful person in an institution was what we call the charge nurse. Back in those days, they all dressed in white. And power in an institution was regulated by your keychain. Anybody that walked around with a keychain and they had lots of keys, they were a powerful person. And all state hospitals are built alike. They're really kind of built like prisons. There's wings that go this way, and in the middle is a nursing station with chicken wire around it in glass. All the locks are from the outside. If you're in, you can't open the door unless somebody opens it for you. Not really very, very pretty places. There was another option for parents in the early days if you had a lot of money. There were a number of private institutions around the country where parents with money would place their children for lifetime care in these large, expensive institutions. There's one in Santa Barbara called Devereaux, which is absolutely beautiful. It's still there today. It's greatly downsized, but it's on the beach right by the university. And there were some people, if they could afford that. Keep in mind, there were no programs like this. There were no educational programs. There was nothing. You either kept your child at home, we called them closet babies, or you placed them in an institution. The parents responded to this bad situation in the 1950s, and in 1950 the ARC of the United States was established, and parents began to ask questions and say,